I'm going to welcome you to tonight's webinar. So a really big thank you for joining us this week. I know it is a particularly challenging week with what many of you as classroom practitioners are preparing for as things change next week. It's super to see so many of you giving your time tonight to this brilliant initiative, which is the Great Science Share. Hopefully talking about books is going to distract and inspire us today. So thank you for being here. I'm Kate Redhead. I am Regional Mentor for the Primary Science Teaching Trust. I'm based in the West Midlands, and I've got the really lovely job of being able to work with primary schools on their primary science curriculum. Before I worked for the Trust, I was an assistant head for several years at a large primary in Birmingham. And during that time, I was science lead, and I did begin to run Great Science Shares. And in the West Midlands, it's kind of grown from that. We had a very small event at in a science lab in my old school. And in 2019, before the world went a bit mad, we had lots of really big events at universities in the West Midlands. So I know it's something that I'm hugely passionate about. If you have been involved in it before, brilliant. There are some ideas for you tonight. If it's brand new to you, hopefully you will be inspired to take part. So one of my hats is a Great Science Share champion, and that is because I see the value of the initiative. But if you are here as a West Midlands school and you've not made contact with me before, please do. If you'd like support in setting up a share this year, and there are lots of different ways that you could do that in the current climate, then please do get in touch. Okay, so a quick overview of tonight's webinar. So just very quickly then, what we're going to be thinking about tonight is we're going to essentially be thinking about the why, the how, and the what of using books as hooks into encouraging children to ask questions, which is what the Great Science Share is all about. So we'll be starting with some general pedagogy around using books as hooks, and then moving into directing it more towards the Great Science Share and some ideas that you might be able to use for the initiative. We know that children are naturally curious about the world around us. We know that questioning plays such a vital role in learning, but children do need support and structure in framing questions. And I think books provide a really excellent stimulus for prompting this curiosity. So to get us started, we have got this really lovely picture of the magic that books can bring us. And we've also got the extract of a poem from Gervais Finn called Treasure. So opening the covers of a book is like lifting the lid of a treasure chest. Look inside and you will find golden stories and glittering characters. And I think I particularly like the line in there, lifting the lid of a treasure chest. I know that's how I feel about books. I don't know about you. During this particular lockdown, I've been reading more than ever. And I think it's just such a lovely image of what books can bring to us. And I know as teachers, we work so hard to try and make sure that that treasure does not remain buried treasure to our children, and that they experience that joy of books. So I'm going to ask you now then to drop into the chat the name of a favourite book of yours from when you were a child. So it doesn't need to be linked to science, but a book that you particularly remember as a child experiencing that joy about and reading more than once. I can see Claire, hi Claire, already giving us hers, which was Sting of the Dump, The Hobbit, Danny Champion of the World. I think I saw the twit there, Matilda. The Owl Who Was Afraid of the Dark. Ruth, I think that might be my colleague, Ruth Shallcross. Ruth, that's exactly the one that I was going to talk about. The Owl Who Was Afraid of the Dark was my absolute favourite. I'm not sure about you, Ruth. For me, it was the fact initially that the character's name was Plop. I think that particularly excited me as a 6 or a 7-year-old. And so it became a book that I read over and over. I think I thought the name was really funny, and then that got me hooked into what was a lovely story. Good night, Mr. Tom. Enid Blyton. I love Enid Blyton too. The Door That Wasn't There. Sarah, I've never read that one. Some lovely ideas there. Thank you, everyone, for starting us off with some lovely contributions. I think tonight it's about tapping into that joy. It's about tapping into that interest that we have and sharing that with our children. And I think when we reflect on many books, particularly in that list, I think as well, there are links to science that we might not immediately see. So The Owl Who Was Afraid of the Dark has actually got links to science in terms of light topics, because there's a lot of light that could be drawn from that book. So there's quite a lot there, I think, in your ideas that you might be able to immediately think, oh yeah, well, there'd be some science in there. In the famous 5, there's a lot of outdoor stuff, isn't there? So maybe there might be elements in there that could link to the science curriculum. It's interesting that when we share our joy of books, what we tend to focus on are fiction books. We tend to focus on storybooks. They're the ones that particularly stand out in our minds. But tonight we are going to be considering fiction, non-fiction, and poetry. All of these types of stories, books, poetry, they all allow learning to become more meaningful and accessible and fun for children. And what we've got in there is we've got pictures, we've got characters, we've got text that can help develop and support understanding. Really helping to develop speaking and listening skills and supporting children in asking questions. So what we're going to do to start us off tonight is we're just going to quickly consider all of those 3, and we're starting with fiction. So just moving on to fiction. And I think here it's worth just recognising that there are a lot of parallels that we can draw between fiction, between storybooks, and between the route that a science investigation might take. So in our literacy, our English lessons, we often use the story mountain structure, and we talk about a setting, a problem, and a resolution. And I think there are parallels that we can draw there to the science process. And then there's also the other science skills like observation, prediction, evaluation. So the children thinking, what's this book going to be about? What's going to happen next? Possibly asking them to consider and reflect what's going to happen as this story progresses. And then I think what is particularly important when it comes to fiction is that we've got that buy-in of the characters in whatever the story is. So the children want to help the character, or they want to know what's going to happen next. They're very invested in the story. So using stories within science lessons has got lots to offer, and it's something that children are familiar with, definitely when they enter school, but hopefully before that as well. So here we've got different examples of fiction books. So we've got our traditional tales, the Gingerbread Man and the 3 Little Pigs, and links that could be made to science topic areas. So we've got materials and we've got forces. And then we've got more picture books, so Where the Wild Things Are and My Friend Plop, and how they might link. And then we've got the longer books that, of course, you wouldn't necessarily just be able to drop in to a science lesson unless it was an extract, but it might be that you have cross-curricular links there with what's happening in your literacy topic or in your guided reading. So we've got Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and we've got Charlotte's Web. So Charlotte's Web, very clearly, life cycles. And Charlie and the Chocolate Factory has got so many different links. I know that in one of Jules Pottle's books, she looks carefully at all of the different ways that you can pull out learning from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and materials is one of them. So again, into the chat, slightly different. Are there storybooks already that you know that you've used in science that link to topics? Or as you are sitting and thinking about it, are there books where you think, yes, I could link that to science? And if I could ask you to drop it into the chat, just the name of the book that you've used and then the link. Great, Jack and the Beanstalk with plants, lovely. The Gruffalo, ecosystems. So as you're watching these come up, guys, just as I am, it's worth pointing out, if you're not clear already on, if you're not that au fait with Zoom yet, you probably are, there's 3 dots on the bottom right-hand corner. You can actually copy the chat at the end, and then you can magpie many of these ideas. The bad-tempered ladybird, the hungry caterpillar. Hello, red fox, the senses. Oh, lovely. I've never used that. So I think what's lovely is we're able to share ideas and then be able to pinch from each other. And if we were in person, we'd have lots of books and we'd have more open discussion. But it's super to see so many ideas on the chat as well. Brick materials. I know Sarah Eames and I, a big favourite of ours is Leaf Man, which is particularly good when you're working outside with the children. And you're looking at recognising trees as well. Lovely, thank you everyone. We're going to move on, but do remember that you can copy that chat if you want to. So we've looked then at fiction, thinking then about non-fiction. And I think non-fiction are possibly what people would more automatically go to when they think about linking books to science. And looking at our examples here, we've got knowledge-focused factual books. So ones that are possibly more linked to the topics. And it might be that you often do that sort of thing in your class reading to supplement whatever it is that your topic is in science at that time. We've got books around scientists. And with British Science Week next week, it might be that you're thinking about looking at real scientists next week. And then we've also got the more unusual non-fiction texts like Smart Pickings, which are super for stimulus for ideas. So if you've not come across Smart Pickings before, I definitely have a look at that because it is quite different to a lot of the other non-fiction texts that are out there. So more than storybooks, I think, with non-fiction texts, we've often got photographs and more detailed diagrams that can give children more accurate visual stimulus for exploring the world of science. And as well, there is the way that the scientific vocabulary is often more accurately put in context. So those elements of non-fiction, I think, often do stand head and shoulders above fiction text, but we're not comparing everything we can use. It's just looking at the pros and cons of both. So non-fiction text, super for developing children's research skills, which is one of the 5 areas of science inquiry. And then there's that great element of independent study and prompting the children to ask questions. So moving on then to poetry, and poetry can provide a nice quick snapshot of a hook when you're perhaps a bit more limited on time as opposed to a longer storybook. Now, I put these slides together when it was snowing outside, so the outdoor song at that time seemed particularly appropriate, and now of course all the snow has melted. But we've got 2 poems here. The first one is the Outdoor Song by A.M. Milne, which if you're a fan of Winnie the Pooh, you will know very well. And the second one is an extract from Michael Rosen's Centrally Heated Knickers book called Making Rainbows, so linking very nicely to the light topic. You have probably come across this book before, but if you haven't, Michael Rosen's Centrally Heated Knickers has got some superb poetry inside that can be linked to the science curriculum. It's a real favourite of mine. And my all-time Michael Rosen poem that is my favourite is the one about chocolate. You might know it. I hope you do, but I'm just going to share my enjoyment of it. It's about a little boy who has a piece of chocolate and he's going home. He's very excited about this chocolate and he holds it tight and he looks at it and he thinks about his excitement and he holds it tighter and he walks home and eventually realizes, distraught, that his chocolate has melted. And then he realizes it's fine and he licks it off his hand. Now, I have used this, and I'm sure some of you may have used this in early years for the children exploring the world around them. It's a superb activity that is often used in that area of school. But it's also a lovely starting point as a prompt for older children when they're looking at the changes in state of materials. And I think what's important to point out here, particularly with poetry, is that the children we teach are children, and that poetry gives us a lovely vehicle for injecting some joy into our teaching and learning. What's not full of joy than having a piece of chocolate in your hand melting? And I think there's probably never been a more important time than to try and inject some joy into our teaching and learning. So yeah, poetry is a really lovely way to do that. So books can be used as a standalone lesson. It could be used as a series of lessons, maybe across different subjects or just kept within science. It's whatever works for you at the time. But I think once you start looking for science links in books and poetry, you start to see that those links are actually everywhere. Okay, so our stimulus being covered, it's important to recognise then that the children are going to need some support in developing their questioning skills. Now, it might be that you are confident that your children have got some superb questioning skills already, or you might have concerns and feel that you're at the start of the journey. Whichever end of the spectrum you are at, question makers are a really good tool for supporting the children in giving them ideas for question starters. So what I've got here is a screenshot of 4 of the question makers that are produced by the Great Science Share. They're on the website. There's a QR code that takes you directly to the right page, but it's pretty easy to find once you're on the website. And they're all of a similar ilk in that they give kind of a fun aspect to supporting the children in their question prompts. So each of them works slightly differently. The question spinner is a circle with question starter words at the start, around the edge of the circle. And the children have a pencil with a paperclip around the bottom and they spin it to find which word they are going to challenge themselves to ask a question beginning with. The question teller is a take on the old fortune teller origami approach and has got a couple of words for the children to begin their questions with. So perhaps would work in a more collaborative sense when you're at the point where the children are moving around quite a lot. The one that is a favourite of mine has always been the question frame. Now, obviously, we can print them off in colour and use them. I've got one that I actually made for a group of children when I was doing some outdoor learning, made of my own card. And it's super for outdoors because you can put it on top of something and there are things like, what can I see? What questions do I have? But it's also really good for books because the children can actually use them to focus in on an image or a particular part of text. And that might work well if you've got children who might get overwhelmed by looking at whole text. So question frames, one of my favourites, but of course it's going to be whatever works best for you. Okay, so whilst we are looking at our books, our stories, our non-fiction texts. We are doing all of these things. We're really encouraging that dialogue because we've got the talk that comes through their curiosity. And in verbalizing their thoughts, hopefully we'll be able to pick up on some misconceptions. We'll hear their predictions. The children will build on each other's ideas and hopefully begin to ask questions. And I think now beginning to focus more in more detail on the great science share approach, it's thinking, well, in a science classroom, we've got to think carefully about whether or not our question is a scientific question. And so what I want to just do here is pull on some work from the Siri team in the QSmart project and a definition of a piece of work that they've done towards the definition of what is a scientific question. And it's quite a detailed definition, but I think it's really useful. A scientific question stimulates inquiry so that evidence is gathered, conclusions are drawn, and knowledge develops. So if we think about it, there are some very big parts to that question that would show us, well, this is definitely a scientific question. And I know that Lynn and the team are very keen on making sure that children understand that there are no wrong questions. And I think that's important for us as practitioners as well. It's more about trying to acknowledge that we're working towards questions in the science classroom that are different to the questions that we might ask in a history classroom or a literacy classroom. We are supporting the children to develop their skills, and we're recognising that this is going to develop over time. They're not necessarily going to suddenly come up with the perfect science question, the perfect scientific question, but working towards sharing a definition like this with them and picking questions apart together when you're further down the line is something that you might consider. But recognising we want to be able to gather evidence so that we can make conclusions and that we can learn things rather than carrying out a nice fun activity that we enjoy but we can't link the science to. Okay, so we've talked about the why. We're now going to look at the how, and here I'm going to share two specific books that are mainly linked to climate change, which is the Great Science Share theme this year. This one is hugely linked to climate change, and this one is our fiction example. This one is called Hunter's Great Escape. It's a lovely book. It is based on a true story, and it is produced by the Wild Tribe Heroes, who have produced a series of books that I'll show you when we've had a look at Hunter and his adventure. So I'm just going to share with you a brief synopsis of the story with some of the pages from the book. The idea being that if you're wanting to take part in the Great Science Share and you want to follow the theme, that you don't need to go hunting too hard for books out there that are on climate change. We've got some really lovely examples tonight to share with you. So Hunter, I'm going to share a synopsis of his story, and then I'm going to be asking you, what sort of questions do you think children might ask about this story? Okay, set in an icy Arctic world, we meet Hunter the polar bear. Hunter has a beautiful white coat and his favourite prey is seals. Hunter usually waits for seals to come up for air to catch them, but today he's really hungry and he tries to catch them whilst they sleep on ice floes. However, luck is not on Hunter's side, and the seals escape his sharp claws, and the ice around Hunter begins to break into smaller pieces. Hunter finds himself in the open ocean. The ice has melted, and he swims for many hours until he finds an iceberg to rest on. But there he is stranded for several days. All the time, the iceberg melts beneath him. Finally, Hunter finds his way onto a sharp cliff face, but then has to be lifted off by the Coast Guard. And a vet has to use a tranquilizer dart to make sure Hunter doesn't hurt anyone. They use a helicopter and ropes to return him to where the ice is thicker. And Hunter stands and waits for the seals. Okay, story time over. Hope you enjoyed it. A little synopsis of the story there. Obviously, the book itself, a lot more detail, lots of lovely images, but you could see quite a few of those there. Could I ask you then into the chat to just drop any questions that you think the children might have about what we've just shared? Thank you, Ruth, getting us going. Why is the ice melting? How cold is really cold? Like it. Do polar bears eat anything else? What happens if all the ice melts? How do the animals stay warm? How did the iceberg hold Hunter's weight? How far can he swim? What's a tranquilizer? Where did he go? How often and how much does polar bear need to eat to survive? Yeah, because he was swimming for several days, so imagining he probably didn't eat anything then. Why couldn't he get back to the ice? Why can't he swim back? Why did he need to be rescued? How many seals would he need to eat in a day? Oh, lovely, super, thank you. Great, thank you, everyone. A lot of those questions are the sorts that I also thought of, and the activity that we've just done, which I can see lots of you are continuing to add to, which is brilliant. You probably, like me, have in your time done the post-it approach. So for me, it's a new book. I'm approaching it with the children. I want them to be asking lots of questions. So I've read through the book and I've put on it all the different post-it questions, all the different questions on post-its that I think the children might ask. So definitely not an exhaustive list, lots of questions that you've put on there that I hadn't thought of, but it does give me a starting point as a practitioner. If the children are new to questioning, if they need a little bit of prompting, it gives me somewhere to go. But obviously, this is something that you would do all the time in a reading session. So it's just making sure that we apply those into our science classroom as well. So a lot of your questions you can probably see here in my questions as well. And I think from these questions, I was only able to fit a certain number on post-its on the screen so that we'd be able to read them. A lot of them are similar to yours. And between all of ours, I think we can see that we've got lots of different inquiry types being raised there. And again, that importance of stressing there are no wrong questions. Although we are thinking about what makes a scientific question, we're getting there. It's a journey that we will go on. So there are no wrong questions. And if it's what children are interested in, then that's a direction that can be taken and must be taken, because we must value what the children are interested in. So we've got some closed and some opinion questions and some very clear closed and opinion questions here. How cold is it? And how much do polar bears weigh? And it could be a discussion with the children. Well, can we find that out ourselves? Is that something that we can investigate ourselves? Can we go and take the thermometer at the Arctic, or do we need to actually do some research, having that discussion? And then, are polar bears scary? Well, that's a matter of opinion. So talking about what type of question that is and how we might go about answering it. So obviously, some questions might be answered more quickly than others, but for the purposes of a share, it's about having that scientific question definition in mind and prompting the children to recognise from all these questions, which do we think we might be able to investigate? Which might we be able to look at in more detail ourselves in order to gather evidence, in order to draw conclusions and develop new knowledge? And I think if you look at lots of questions like this together, that's part of the journey in moving the children forward in their understanding of questioning. Okay, so thinking then about the questions and how it might link to a share. What might this actually look like in a share? And we had quite a lot of questions about how Hunter stays warm. So that question about how does a polar bear keep warm in the Arctic? And one investigation that the children can do, which you may be familiar with, is the blubber hands investigation. Excuse me, I've got the hiccups. The blubber hands investigation. I know that this was one at the very first share that I ran. Some children did this. So bare rubber gloves into ice. What does that feel like? Covering them in grease or fat, and then back in the ice. Can they feel a difference? And there are resources out there that can support you with this. Why is the polar bear white? So another adaptation question that would hopefully lead the children to recognizing that he's white. Hunter, he is white to camouflage him from the seals so that he can catch them more easily. And it could lead to camouflage-based activities. So very quick question. In the top image, how many polar bears can you see? Into the chat, how many do you think you can see? Oh, Heather, you like the blubber hands activity? Great. 5. Claire and Sarah can both see 5. Some people 7, 6, 3, 7. Okay, I'm not as bad at camouflaging as I thought then. The answer is 8. I don't think that activity would stand for a great science share because it was quite difficult to do, to hide white on white. So it might not necessarily be the direct activity, the direct investigation that could be done around polar bears, but that some sort of camouflaging activity could be run. And there are things out there. There is a Starters for Science video that looks at just that, looks at camouflage. So there are lots of links that can be drawn that can still be exploring the area of climate change. How did the hunters lift? How did the humans lift Hunter? Well, there'd be that discussion around the likelihood of some sort of pulley system being used. The children could investigate those. Again, there are resources there to support with that. And then finally, around icebergs, the children could do a lot of investigations with ice. So does ice always float? Can things balance on top of it? Will it tip over? What temperature does it need to be for it to melt? Would different materials make it melt more slowly? How long would it take? Those sorts of questions would all be really valid here. And I'm sure you can think of lots of others, but it's looking at how you would move from the book to activities that the children could have on their tabletops with their questions. So I mentioned that Hunter's Icy Adventure is part of a series. It's part of the Wild Tribe Heroes series of books. There are 5 here. One of the schools that I'm working with is actually a 4th form entry primary, and each class, is going to use one of the books for their share. So they're going to have a slightly different take on the types of activities that they do, which is really lovely. So it's a set of books that's out there, and on their website there are also lesson prompts and teacher resources that are free to download. Okay, so that was our fiction example. We went into quite a lot of detail. We're not going to go into quite as much detail with our non-fiction text because I think we get the idea about drawing the two together. But the non-fiction text that I've chosen tonight is a lovely book from Catherine Barr. Catherine Barr is an expert in ecology. She worked for Greenpeace and the Natural History Museum, and what I'm always astounded by Catherine's books is how she manages to get such a superb level of detail and factual content into children's books in an accessible manner. She's got a whole range of books that are very strongly linked to climate change. And I think the one that I've chosen tonight isn't necessarily that strongly linked, but there's a reason for that. I've chosen Invisible Nature. And the reason that I've chosen that is because I've got specific examples from shares that I've run in the past with questions that children ran that could easily have come as a prompt from Invisible Nature book. So it was just to show you some pictures of an actual share, because obviously last year things were very, very different, and normally it would be looking at those actual examples. So Invisible Nature is all about it's about how animals use light, scent, sounds and forces beyond our senses to survive. And then it looks closely at how we as humans have developed using some of their strategies too. So things like microwaves, how they were created, how we use them in everyday lives in computers, radiotherapy, radar and kitchens, ultrasound, how animals such as dolphins, whales, bats and small animals use these to communicate with each other, how humans use them to train pets, develop sonar systems and automatic doors, ultraviolet light, how many animals use them to survive, and how we need UV light for our bones to strengthen and our muscles, but that too much UV light can be harmful and damaging to us. It did look there that the pages were quite squashed. It is a very wide book, and they are double page spreads, so they are very big books, but superb to look at when you've got the book itself. So looking at some examples from shares that I've run and activities that went particularly well at those shares. This is an example from a 2019 share in Coventry. We had a superb event on the day of the Great Science Share. We were at the university, the children saw a lecture theatre, some of them went to visit the engineering centre, they worked with student ambassadors, it was lovely. But this particular school this particular group of children wanted to investigate whether, if they limited their other senses, their taste was affected. So obviously you would have that link there to Invisible Nature in terms of senses. But what you can see here is the pure enjoyment on this young man's face. He has got earmuffs on, ear defenders, he's got an eye mask. They did have nose clips, but I think some children chose not to use those, and I can see this young man hasn't got that. But the idea was that they tasted and tested different food types to see whether or not they could determine what they were. And the children absolutely loved that activity, and they did learn a lot from it. And then the other example to share was from another Great Science Share in the Midlands, which was where the children wanted to explore the impact of UV light, and they wanted to explore which materials would give the best protection. So they built humans from pipe cleaners with UV beads. They had UV pens, UV light pens, and they were looking at which materials blocked the UV light the best. And that was a particularly good activity as well, because a lot of the children from other schools who were part of the share hadn't come across the concept of UVBs. They hadn't got that understanding, and it really helped them to develop the difference between artificial light and sunlight. Okay, so similarly, Invisible Nature is one of a series of books. So this is these are some of the other books from Catherine Barr. Climate Change, the story of climate change, is actually brand new and out this week, so I haven't seen a copy of that one yet. But Red Alert is a particularly strong book that is a particular favourite of mine. And the reason for that is the way that it is actually structured. It's got quite a different way of encouraging the children to take ownership of their research. So the book itself is around 15 endangered animals that are on the red list, and it prompts children to look at different habitats, choose a habitat that they particularly like or are interested in, and then select an animal from within that habitat and go to the part of the book that is about that animal and find out lots of different things about them before being directed to another part of the book to find out how they might impact change and be able to contribute towards removing that animal from the red list. It's a really nice way of the children interacting and carrying out their own research, as opposed to the typical content and index list. So a particularly strong one to look out for. So, of course, I've shared with you fairly new books. You may not have these books in school. The idea of sharing them with you was in case you were not really sure where to start in terms of climate change and what sort of books to look for and how to link that to a great science share activity. But another way, if there's no budget and if you've not got these particular books, another way of doing it is to think about the theme weeks that are being put out as part of the Great Science Share. Now, the themes themselves aren't fully confirmed yet. They'll be fully confirmed next month. But these are the broad themes as they stand. They will start in the first week in May and lead up to the Great Science Share event in June. And what I've tried to do is have a fairly lengthy list, but not exhaustive and not huge, but a fairly lengthy list on ideas of books that could hook into each of those themed areas. This will come out to you as a PDF. The idea being that you can have a quick glance through that list and immediately think, oh, I've got that one, I've got that one, I've got that one. There are some really strong ones on there, and I really hope that there are some that you think, yes, I've got those books, I might be able to pick up and use them, or you might be interested in some of the ones that we've shared tonight in more detail. Okay, so I'm going to take myself off screen share, and it would be great to hear from you, if you are happy to, whether or not you've already got ideas for books as hooks into the Great Science Share. If there's anything in particular you wanted to ask, it would be lovely to hear from you, because I've talked solidly so far. This is where we're all quiet and want to go for a cup of tea.
Do you want me to say something, Kate?
Thank you, Sarah. That would be lovely.
I've got my hand up. Yeah, I love the theme of the polar bears and doing about polar bears and linking that to climate change as well, because I think that's something that's quite emotive with the children. And I know that we've got a polar bear which is as big as me in our school that we call Climate Change Clive. And so the children know whenever he's wheeled into assemblies, it's going to be something about the environment or about eco matters or something. But I think it's a really good theme to do. And I know it was the same last year as well, wasn't it? So I know that we'd got loads of plans and they didn't actually come to fruition because of what happened last year. So it's really nice that you've given that idea that I'm thinking, you know what, I might go back to polar bears now and we might do some more about polar bears. So I love that idea. And I think that's it. Don't create loads of work, because there are so many resources out there that you can link into, like things from the Titanic book or things from, I can't even remember what it was called, Polar Explorer program.
Yeah.
Wasn't it? And they've got quite a few things about climate change as well. But yes, I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. I know with the Hunter's Icy Adventure obviously links itself particularly well to ice. On the PSTT Whistle Stop Science Week's resource, there's a week specifically about ice. So there's lots of ideas there. And yeah, I think there's never been a time, I think you're right, Sarah, there's never been a time where it's more important not to create work for ourselves. So looking at what's already out there and accessing it. Kerry is starting a Worms Week next week for British Science Week. Oh, that sounds lovely. I assume you're going to have some actual worms in school or in the outdoor area.
Well, Kate, I'm trying to link with as many sort of outside of school agencies as possible. Obviously, that's a little bit tricky at the moment. So we're working with a group called Grow Cardiff, and they were doing lots of allotment bits and pieces. So they've done a couple of videos for me. So we've got some worm experts as well.
Fantastic. I think Jane has just put some worm investigation link on there for you.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you.
And I don't know if Kerry, if you're part of the STEM learning. Oh, Sarah Eames, I know that you're on this as well. The STEM learning discussion forum platform. I know that fairly recently on there was someone talking a lot about worms. Am I remembering that rightly, Sarah? Do you remember seeing that one?
I can't remember. I've just put into the thing that's how Darwin started, looking at worms in his own back garden and trying to predict how many worms there were going to be. And then apparently he dug up his back garden and he was actually really wrong. He really underestimated how many worms there were. But yeah, anything to get the children out, worm hunting and worm charming and amazing creatures.
Kerry, there's loads in the chat. Thank you, everyone. That is brilliant that you're all sharing so much. You've got links to the biggest worm in the UK. Farmer time might be something. Yeah, I know Brian Hainsworth from Leaf came to share in Coventry the year before last, and he had the children actually handling worms. And initially there was all the shrieking and I'm not going to do that. And then by the end of it, I think they'd all done it and they didn't want to give him the worms back. Oh, Carla says, check the children's classroom trays as one of my girls last year was keeping a worm in it. Yeah, we don't really want that, do we? Anyone else got any snippets to share? Worm watch, don't know, might be worth a look. Yes, Steph, I assume that you've got, Steph, have you got Kerry's email address? She's not able to copy the chat. If you were able to copy the chat and send it to her, obviously I've not got her email and contact details.
Yeah, that's fine. And if everyone else wants that, I can make sure you get that after the meeting. Yeah.
Because there were lots of ideas in terms of books there as well earlier on in the chat. Oh, I think Steph has put some questions up for you. Yeah, Steph, I think there's a few people that can't copy the chat, so I don't know if is it possible to send that out with the PDFs for the session? Brilliant. Thank you. So the PDFs for this session, as well as the chat, is there's the PDF of the slides and then the books as hooks list, just as a reference point. Okay, has anyone got anything else they would like to share?
It's more of a question really about the poetry. I know the Michael Rosen, but if you've got children writing poetry with the science theme, like obviously Michael Rosen's done, has anyone done that? And I've got a top tip for starting it, basically, starting it off.
The one, everyone else do chip in on the chat or after I've waffled a bit. The one that I've used most regularly is around materials, and it's a bit like, oh, it's as useful as a chocolate teapot, and it's really good at as useful as a chocolate teapot, and kind of four-line stanzas with two of those within each one. That worked particularly well. I'm not describing it very well. There was no attempt to rhyme, but it was very much about linking the material and the object, and that did seem to have a really good impact on the children.
Okay, thank you.
And then there's some. Yeah.
There's a nice Michael Rosen one about shadows, which I was doing light, and I was thinking, well, they could do their own shadow poem, but I didn't I wasn't quite sure how to get started. Yeah.
I think there are so many different ways, and I think when you're getting started, I think it's the modelling, isn't it, and giving them some sort of framework to start from. But I think if you were able to take one that's got a very structured pattern, and asking them to sort of repeat something very similar, I think you're onto a winner straight away. Steve is lots of insect poetry anthologies that have got different formats or layouts to pinch.
Oh, fab.
There's quite a few things starting to appear in the chat. Ruth is talking about a new book that's been launched on Friday about insects. The bee is not afraid of me. Another book that I often use is I Like This Poem, and it's got lots of different poem types in there, patterned poems, rhyming poems, longer ones, shorter ones.
Great, thank you. I like the insect idea as well.
Yeah, I like the idea of that as well. Any other thoughts or questions? The Big Book of Bugs. I don't know that one. Okay, shall we? Oh, The Planet Full of Plastic. Is that a poetry book? Or is that another very good climate change book? Sounds like a good climate change book. I think it might be on the list, actually.